He announced he was leaving me for his assistant during our anniversary dinner, showing off the keys to their dream home. What he didn't know was that I already owned the house they were planning their future in. The crystal champagne flutes clinked with a hollow sound that seemed to echo through the private dining room of La Maison Rouge. The restaurant's soft lighting cast a warm glow across the white tablecloth, illuminating the anniversary dinner. I'd spent weeks planning. 15 years of marriage, all leading to this moment, though not the one I had anticipated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Carmen, meet Grace, Carlos said, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. She's not just my executive assistant anymore. Grace stood there in a figure-hugging emerald dress that I recognized immediately. It was from the designer collection I'd admired last month but had decided against purchasing because Carlos had complained about our overspending. Her honey blonde hair was styled in loose waves, catching the candlelight as she slid into what should have been an empty chair at our intimate table for two. I sat frozen, my carefully applied lipstick suddenly feeling like a mask as I watched. My husband poured champagne into 3 glasses, using the vintage Veuve Clicquot I'd special ordered for what should have been our celebration. I think we should clear the air, Carlos continued, his voice carrying that familiar, authoritative tone he'd perfected in the boardroom of Rivera Enterprises. Grace and I have been working closely for some time now, and things have evolved. Grace shifted slightly, perhaps catching something in my too calm demeanor. She was young, early 30s to my 42, but old enough to know better. Old enough to understand that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. Old enough to face the consequences of her choices. Carlos reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a set of keys, placing them ceremoniously on the table between us. A small, silver keychain with a custom-designed R dangled from the ring, the signature of Rivera Properties' most exclusive developments. "We've purchased the lakeside property in Westlake Shores," he said, a triumphant smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Closing was finalized yesterday." I felt my breath catch. Westlake Shores, the exclusive community I'd researched for, months before finding the perfect plot. The dream home whose architectural plans I'd revised countless times. The property purchased through my family's holding company as an anniversary surprise. "How wonderful," I said, lifting my champagne, with a steady hand. "To new beginnings." Grace beamed, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "The house is absolutely gorgeous. I've already started planning the interior design. The master suite has this amazing view of the lake." She continued describing my house to me in vivid detail. The natural stone fireplace I'd specially sourced from a quarry in Vermont, the floor-to-ceiling windows I'd insisted on for the great room, the custom kitchen with the imported Italian marble I'd selected. Carlos watched me over the rim of his glass, clearly pleased with how calmly I was taking the news. He'd always underestimated me, mistaking my measured responses for weakness, my strategic thinking for passivity. "We've hired Kendall Williams to handle the interior design," Grace continued, her excitement palpable. "She's going to transform it into a showpiece. Carlos says we'll be the envy of everyone in his executive circle." "Kendall is very talented," I agreed, thinking of the non-disclosure agreement the designer had signed with my holding company. "She has excellent taste." Carlos reached for Grace's hand on the table, his wedding ring catching the light. "We wanted to tell you in person, Carmen. The paperwork will be delivered tomorrow. Everything's been arranged by the firm." What Carlos didn't realize, as he sat there outlining how our assets would be divided, was that I'd been preparing for this moment for months. Not this exact scenario. I hadn't anticipated the particular cruelty of an anniversary dinner announcement. But I'd seen the signs. The late nights, the business trips that multiplied, the sudden interest in properties I'd researched. I'd also remembered what Carlos had apparently forgotten: the prenuptial agreement my mother had insisted upon before our wedding. My mother, the shrewd businesswoman who had built Rivera Enterprises alongside Carlos's father before both companies merged, along with our families. The prenup that specifically protected my family's investments and any assets purchased through my trust. "I'm sure your lawyer has everything in order," I said, the irony of my statement lost on them both. Grace's fingers played with the silver bracelet on her wrist. My grandmother's bracelet, a family heirloom that had mysteriously disappeared from my jewelry box 3 months ago. How fitting that she'd chosen to wear it tonight. "Carlos has been so generous," Grace gushed, either missing or ignoring the subtle tension. "He says once we're settled, we can discuss my role in the company's marketing division. I have so many ideas for rebranding." Each word she spoke was another thread in the web they'd woven, believing themselves clever and untouchable. They had no idea that while they'd been planning their grand reveal, I'd been orchestrating something far more intricate. "If you'll excuse me," I said, rising from the table with practiced grace. "I need a moment." In the privacy of the elegant restroom, I checked my reflection. Not a hair out of place, not a smudge in my carefully applied makeup. The woman staring back at me looked polished, controlled, and dangerous. Tonight wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of something else entirely. I took out my phone and sent a single text to my attorney, Courtney. "Proceed." As I returned to the table, I allowed myself a small smile. Carlos and Grace were huddled close, examining something on his phone, probably interior design ideas for a house they would never occupy. My house. The lakefront property purchased through my family's holding company, Rivera Vega Properties, named after my mother's side of the family. I retook my seat, watching as they exchanged confident glances over their champagne glasses. My phone buzzed quietly in my purse, right on schedule. In precisely 30 minutes, everything they had built their little fantasy upon would begin to crumble. Carlos would learn what it meant to underestimate me, and Grace would learn that some dreams aren't meant to be hers. "Tell me, Grace," I said, leaning forward slightly, "how long have you been wearing my grandmother's bracelet?" The color drained from both their faces, and I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. This was just the first domino. I don't know what you're talking about," Grace stammered, her hand instinctively covering the silver bracelet. "Carmen," Carlos warned, his voice low. "Not here." But I merely smiled, reaching for my water glass with deliberate calm. I'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of composure as the wife of Carlos Rivera, CEO of Rivera Enterprises. 15 years of standing beside him at corporate galas, hosting dinner parties for investors, and maintaining the perfect image his position demanded. What most people didn't see, what Carlos himself had forgotten, was who I had been before. I became Mrs. Rivera. I was Carmen Vega, daughter of Elena Vega, one of the shrewdest real estate developers in the Southwest. My mother had built Vega Properties from nothing, eventually partnering with Rivera Enterprises in a merger that benefited both families. I'd grown up studying market trends over breakfast, learning to read people from watching my mother in negotiations, and developing an eye for valuable assets that others overlooked. When Carlos and I had met at a charity gala 16 years ago, he'd been impressed by my knowledge of architectural design and market forecasting. Back then, he'd valued my mind, as much as my presence on his arm. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that I wasn't just an accessory to his success. I'd been instrumental in it. "The branch offices in Phoenix were my idea," I said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Remember that, Carlos? When everyone said expanding during the downturn was too risky, I identified the neighborhoods that would rebound first." Carlos shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. This wasn't the docile, dignified exit he'd anticipated. He'd expected tears, perhaps, or quiet resignation, not this calm recitation of my contributions. "And the Riverwalk development?" I continued. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The one that doubled our commercial portfolio last year? Those properties were from my mother's holdings. Grace looked between us, her confident smile faltering. This clearly wasn't the version of his wife that Carlos had described to her. Carmen is very modest about her contributions, Carlos said smoothly, attempting to regain control of the narrative. She's been a wonderful partner in many ways. Partner, I repeated, tasting the word. An interesting choice. Tell me, did you explain to Grace how our partnership began? About the merger agreement? About my family's stake in the company? A flicker of concern crossed his face. This wasn't part of his script. 4 years into our marriage, when Carlos's father had passed away, it was my mother who had helped restructure the company, bringing Rivera Enterprises under the umbrella of her larger Vega holdings, while allowing Carlos to maintain his position as the face of the company. My mother had insisted on protecting my interests with an ironclad prenuptial agreement, knowing all too well how business and marriage could complicate each other. That's ancient history, Carlos dismissed, though I noticed his hand tightening around his champagne glass. We've both contributed to our success. The waiter approached our table, his timing impeccable. He carried a sealed envelope on a silver tray. For Madame Rivera, he said with a slight bow. Thank you, Joseph, I replied, recognizing him as one of the restaurant staff I'd spoken with earlier that week when finalizing the anniversary arrangements. Carlos's brow furrowed in confusion. He hadn't realized I'd been quietly orchestrating this evening just as carefully as he had. How amusing that he still thought this dinner was his idea. I placed the envelope beside my plate without opening it, watching the way Carlos's eyes kept darting toward it. You were saying? I prompted Grace. About the master suite at Westlake Shores? Grace, eager to reclaim her moment, leaned forward. The windows face east to catch the sunrise over the lake. Carlos says we'll be able to see all the way to the nature preserve on clear mornings. That sounds lovely, I agreed. I've always thought morning light is so important for a bedroom. Did Carlos mention that I was the one who selected that particular lot? It has the best elevation in the development. Grace's smile froze. You selected it? Of course, I said lightly. Westlake Shores has been one of my pet projects for the past year. The developers consulted me on several of the premium properties. Carlos cleared his throat. Carmen has always had an excellent eye for real estate. It's one of the many talents I've appreciated. There it was, the subtle pivot, attempting to frame my knowledge as something he'd indulged rather than relied upon. Classic Carlos, rewriting history to suit his narrative. I thought about the hours I'd spent with architects, revising plans for that house. The weekends I'd dedicated to sourcing materials, selecting fixtures, and consulting with landscapers. All while Carlos was apparently romancing his assistant and planning his exit from our marriage. The boathouse was a particular challenge, I continued conversationally. The environmental permits alone took months to secure. But worth it, I think. There's nothing like watching the sunset from the water. How do you know about the boathouse? Grace asked, confusion evident in her voice. We only finalized those plans last week. I smiled, taking a deliberate sip of my champagne. Did you? Carlos shifted in his seat, a flicker of uncertainty crossing. His face for the first time that evening. Grace, perhaps we should discuss the house details another time. But Grace, caught up in her excitement about her future home, continued. Kendall says it's the most impressive property she's worked on. She's planning a feature wall with reclaimed timber for the great room. From the Anderson Mill, I finished for her. Yes, I thought that would be a nice touch. The history of the building materials creates such character, don't you think? Grace stared at me, then at Carlos, who was now looking distinctly uncomfortable. Carlos, she said slowly. How does she know all these details? I reached for the envelope Joseph had delivered, opening it with deliberate slowness, aware of their increasingly anxious stares. Inside was a set of documents I'd had prepared weeks ago, when I'd first confirmed my suspicions about Carlos's affair. "I believe," I said, removing the first page and placing it on the table. "This might answer some of your questions." The document I placed on the table was deceptively simple: a property deed for 47 Lakeside Terrace, Westlake Shores. The owner listed was not Carlos Rivera or even Rivera Enterprises, but Rivera Vega Properties, LLC, my family's holding company. "There must be some mistake," Carlos said, reaching for the document. His confident facade was beginning to crack as he scanned the page. "This can't be right." "No mistake," I replied, removing another page from the envelope. "And here's the architectural approval form, signed by the managing partner of Rivera Vega Properties." I tapped my own signature at the bottom of the page. As you can see, all design changes had to be approved by me. Grace's perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth. "But we bought that house. Carlos showed me the paperwork." "Carlos received permission to use the property," I clarified, "as a company asset. Not much different from how executives use the company jet or vacation properties." I paused, watching realization dawn on her face. "Didn't you think it was unusual that such a premium property was available right when you wanted it? That the design elements were exactly what you'd hoped for?" Carlos's jaw clenched as he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Mike right now," he said, referring to his attorney. "There's clearly been some kind of misunderstanding." "By all means," I encouraged, gesturing to his phone. "Though Mike may be difficult to reach this evening. He called earlier to say he was taking his wife to Cancun for their anniversary." I emphasized the last word slightly, watching it land like a barb. The restaurant continued its elegant hum around us, the other diners oblivious to the drama unfolding at our table. The soft lighting and muted conversations created an incongruous backdrop for the dismantling of a 15-year marriage. "Let me understand this," Grace said slowly, her earlier excitement replaced by growing confusion. "The house at Westlake Shores is actually owned by your family company?" "That's correct," I confirmed. "I purchased it through Rivera Vega Properties 10 months ago when the development first broke ground. I personally oversaw the architectural plans and design elements, working with Kendall Williams on the interior concepts." "But Carlos," I interrupted gently, "has been operating under some misconceptions about our financial arrangement. In the early years of our marriage, Carlos had been deeply involved in every aspect of our finances, insisting on overseeing all investment decisions and major purchases. But as Rivera Enterprises grew and his responsibilities expanded, he'd gradually delegated more of the domestic matters to me. What he hadn't realized was how strategically I'd positioned our assets over the years. 5 years ago," I continued, "when we restructured the company after the merger with Western Holdings, you signed documents transferring several residential properties to Rivera Vega Properties for tax purposes." I removed another document from the envelope, including any future acquisitions in the luxury residential category. Carlos stared at the document, recognition slowly dawning on his face. He'd been so focused on the commercial side of the business that he'd paid little attention to what he considered secondary concerns. "You never said anything about this," he accused, his voice low. "You never asked," I replied simply. "And it never seemed relevant until now." Grace looked between us, the reality of her situation becoming increasingly clear. "So the house is not yours," I completed for her. "It never was." Carlos's phone buzzed with an incoming message. His face darkened as he read it. "What have you done?" he demanded. "Nothing that wasn't already set in motion by your own actions," I answered calmly. "When unusual spending patterns appear in company accounts, certain protocols are triggered. You established those protocols yourself, if you recall, after the Jensen embezzlement scandal. 3 years ago, when a senior executive had been caught diverting company funds, Carlos had implemented strict financial oversight measures. Any unusual transactions would be flagged and reported to the board's audit committee, a committee that included my mother as a senior member. The company jet to Aspen last month, I continued. The wire transfer to Tiffany's. The down payment for the Westlake property processed through the corporate account. I ticked off each item methodically. All flagged as potential irregularities. Grace tailed visibly. You said those were authorized company expenses, she whispered to Carlos. They were business-related, he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. The board might disagree, I noted, especially given the timing of these expenses and their apparent personal nature. The sophisticated veneer that Grace had been maintaining was beginning to crumble. The confident homewrecker was being replaced by a woman who was suddenly realizing she might be implicated in financial improprieties. I didn't know, she said quickly. Carlos told me everything was above board. Sure he did, I agreed, with a touch of sympathy that surprised even me. In many ways, Grace was just another victim of Carlos's manipulations, albeit a willing one. Carlos straightened in his chair, attempting to reclaim the authority that had been slipping away throughout our conversation. This is ridiculous. You're trying to create a scandal where none exists. Everything I did was within my authority as CEO. Including giving away company property for personal use? I asked mildly. Including using corporate funds to furnish a lifestyle for your girlfriend? I wonder what the shareholders would think about that. The magnificent confidence that Carlos had displayed at the beginning of the evening was crumbling before my eyes. The man who had walked in planning to discard me like an outdated accessory was now beginning to realize that he had severely miscalculated. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice tight. A reasonable question. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Vindication? I want what's mine, I said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. I picked up my phone and checked the time. In approximately 5 minutes, Carlos would receive another message. This one from Benny Rodriguez, the chief financial officer of Rivera Enterprises and a longtime ally of my mother's. The preliminary findings of the internal financial review would be devastating. You can't seriously think you'll take control of the company, Carlos said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. The board would never allow it. I don't want to take control, I corrected him. I simply want to protect what rightfully belongs to me. Including, I added, glancing at Grace, my grandmother's bracelet. Grace's hand instinctively covered the silver bracelet on her wrist, her eyes widening in recognition of its significance. It was a gift, Grace said defensively, though her voice wavered. Carlos gave it to me for my birthday. Interesting, I replied, keeping my tone conversational. Since that bracelet has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandmother gave it to me on our wedding day. I turned to Carlos. You remember that, don't you? How she said it represented the unbroken chain of strong women in my family. Carlos's face had gone rigid, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He'd clearly forgotten the significance of the bracelet when he'd taken it from my jewelry box to give to Grace. I didn't realize, Grace began. Of course you didn't, I cut her off, not unkindly. You weren't meant to. Just like you weren't meant to know about the prenuptial agreement. At that, Carlos's head snapped up. The prenup expired 5 years ago, he said dismissively. It had a 10-year sunset clause. The original draft did, I acknowledged, but my mother insisted on changes before the signing. The final version specified that the agreement remains in effect for the duration of the marriage, with additional protections for any assets acquired through my family's businesses. The blood drained from Carlos's face as he processed this information. He'd been planning this exit for months, possibly years, carefully positioning assets and creating narratives that would benefit him in a divorce. And all that time, he'd been operating under a fundamental misconception about our legal arrangement. His phone buzzed again, right on schedule. Carlos read the message, and I watched as the last vestiges of his confidence crumbled. "What is it?" Grace asked anxiously. "The board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning," he said, his voice hollow. "Apparently, there are serious concerns about financial irregularities that need to be addressed immediately." "What does that mean?" Grace pressed, her earlier excitement about their future home now replaced by growing alarm. "It means," I said gently, "that the narrative is changing." The waiter approached with our first course, an elegant arrangement of seared scallops with butternut squash puree, my favorite, which I'd selected when planning this anniversary dinner weeks ago. The normality of the food service created a surreal contrast to the conversation unfolding at our table. "Thank you, Joseph," I said as he set the plates before us. "Everything looks lovely." Neither Carlos nor Grace made any move toward their food. I took a small bite of my scallop, savoring the perfectly seared exterior and the delicate sweetness of the puree. Even in the midst of dismantling my marriage, I saw no reason to miss out on an excellent meal. "You've been planning this," Carlos accused, finding his voice again. "All of this, the dinner, the documents, the board meeting, you knew." "Of course I knew," I replied, setting down my fork. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the changes in your behavior? The unexplained absences? The sudden interest in properties I'd researched?" I shook my head slightly. "You became careless, Carlos. Perhaps you wanted to be caught." "That's not," he began, then stopped himself. Even now he was calculating, assessing what I knew and what I might be bluffing about. "How long?" I asked, the question I'd decided not to ask until this moment. "How long have you been planning to leave me?" Carlos glanced at Grace, who looked down at her untouched plate. 6 months, he admitted finally. I nodded, absorbing this information. 6 months. Around the time I'd begun to notice small discrepancies in our accounts. Around the time Carlos had suddenly embraced my suggestion to look at properties in Westlake Shores after years of rejecting the idea of a lakeside home. "And the decision to announce it at our anniversary dinner?" I pressed. "Was that your idea? Or Grace's?" Grace's head shot up. I wouldn't." She turned to Carlos. "You told me she already knew. You said this dinner was just a formality, that you'd already discussed separation terms." The pieces clicked into place. Carlos had manipulated both of us, crafting different narratives to serve his purposes. He'd told Grace that our marriage was already effectively over, while keeping me in the dark until this public humiliation. Carlos has always been skilled at controlling narratives, I observed. It's what makes him an effective CEO. He's just not as skilled at controlling outcomes. As if on cue, the maitre d' approached our table, a slim leather portfolio in his hands. "Mrs. Rivera," he said, addressing me directly, "the document you requested." "Thank you, Michelle," I replied, accepting the portfolio. "Your assistance this evening has been invaluable." Carlos watched this exchange with growing apprehension. "What is this now?" I opened the portfolio to reveal a single document, a letter from my attorney, outlining the terms under which Carlos could remain as CEO of Rivera Enterprises following our separation. "Consider it a courtesy," I explained, sliding the document across the table. "A roadmap for how we proceed from here." Carlos scanned the letter, his expression darkening with each line. "These terms are outrageous," he sputtered. 50% reduction in compensation? Oversight committee approval for all major decisions? Immediate return of all personal items removed from our shared residences? He looked up at me in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Those are actually the generous terms," I informed him. "The alternative is that the board receives a complete accounting of your financial creativity over the past 6 months, including the funds diverted through the shell company you created in Grace's name." Grace gasped. "What shell company?" "Horizon Ventures," I supplied. "Incorporated in Nevada 3 months ago. with you listed as the sole director. The same company that recently purchased a Range Rover, several pieces of fine jewelry, and placed a rather substantial deposit on a vacation property in Cabo. Grace turned to Carlos, her expression a mixture of confusion and betrayal. You put those purchases in my name? It was for tax purposes, Carlos insisted, though his explanation sounded hollow even to my ears. Everything would have been properly documented once we were together officially. What it was, I corrected, was an attempt to hide assets before filing for divorce. That's called fraud, Carlos. It's not just grounds for dismissal, it's potentially criminal. The sophisticated evening Carlos had planned, where he would graciously but firmly inform his wife that he was moving on with his younger assistant, had transformed into something else entirely. Instead of the docile, devastated spouse he'd expected, he was facing a woman who had anticipated his every move and countered it precisely. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice low. We could work something out privately, without involving the board or attorneys. I considered him for a moment. This man I'd loved for 15 years, whose ambition and drive I'd once admired, whose success I'd helped build. There was a time when his approval had meant everything to me, when his smile could brighten my darkest day. That time had passed. I'm afraid, I said, picking up my wine glass. That time for private resolutions is behind us. Carlos's phone buzzed again with an incoming message. The noose was tightening. It's from my mother, Carlos said, scanning the message on his phone. She wants to know why Elena Vega is calling her about company finances at 9 o'clock at night. Chill seemed to settle over our table. Carlos's mother, Sofia Rivera, had been largely uninvolved in company matters since her husband's death, preferring to enjoy her retirement. If she was being drawn into this situation, it signaled that the ripples were spreading beyond the corporate boardroom. Your mother has always been fond of me, I remarked mildly. I should call her tomorrow. It's been too long since we had lunch. Carlos set his phone down carefully, as if it might detonate. What exactly do you want, Carmen? He asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Money? The house? Some kind of public apology? It was a revealing question. Even now he was thinking in terms of transactions, what he could give up to make this problem go away. He still didn't understand that this wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. What I want, I said, meeting his gaze directly, is for you to experience the same sense of betrayal and helplessness that I felt when I discovered your affair. The same shock I felt when I realized you were planning to discard 15 years of marriage with a rehearsed speech at an anniversary dinner. Grace flinched at my words, perhaps recognizing for the first time the cruelty inherent in their plan. But since you're asking about practical matters, I continued, I want full ownership of all properties held by Rivera Vega Properties, transferred exclusively to my name. I want my grandmother's bracelet returned. I glanced pointedly at Grace's wrist. And I want you to resign as CEO, effective immediately. Carlos stared at me in disbelief. You can't be serious. Resign as CEO? The board would never accept. The board, I interrupted, already has a candidate in mind for interim leadership. Benny Rodriguez has their confidence, and as chief financial officer, he's intimately familiar with the company's operations. Benny? Carlos looked as if I'd slapped him. My own CFO is part of this? Benny has always been loyal to the company first, I reminded him. When he discovered discrepancies in the financial reports, discrepancies you instructed Grace to create, he did what any responsible executive would do. He investigated. Grace paled. I never falsified any reports. I just processed the transactions as Carlos directed. Including backdating board approvals for personal expenditures? I asked gently. Including creating expense reports for meetings that never happened? Her silence was answer enough. This is absurd, Carlos declared, though his voice lacked conviction. You're creating a corporate crisis over a personal matter. You made it a corporate matter, I countered, when you began using company resources to finance your affair, when you directed Grace to manipulate financial records, when you attempted to transfer company property, the Westlake Shores house, for personal use. The elegant restaurant continued its evening service around us, the soft music and murmured conversations creating a surreal backdrop to the dismantling of Carlos's carefully constructed world. You won't get away with this, he said, but it sounded more like wishful thinking than a threat. I already have, I replied simply. My phone buzzed with an incoming message from Courtney. All documents filed. Board members notified. Meeting set for 8 a.m. Perfect timing. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The waiter approached to clear our mostly untouched first course. Is everything all right with the meal? He asked, noting our full plates. Everything is perfect, Joseph, I assured him. We're just having a rather intense discussion. Of course, madam. The main course will be served in a few minutes. Carlos pushed his chair back abruptly. I need some air, he muttered, standing up. As he strode toward the restaurant's terrace, Grace looked after him uncertainly, then back, at me. For the first time, I saw her clearly. Not as the predatory other woman, but as someone who had been caught in Carlos's web just as surely as I had been, albeit in a different way. He told me you were separating anyway, she said quietly, that you had grown apart years ago and were just keeping up appearances. And you believed him, I noted, not unkindly. He can be very convincing. She twisted the bracelet on her wrist, nervously. I had no idea about any of this. The house, the company issues, your grandmother's bracelet. He said it was an heirloom from his family. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Grace, I said, leaning forward slightly. What do you think happens next? After tonight? She blinked, caught off guard by the question. I don't know. Let me help you with that, I said. Carlos has used company funds illegally. He's created fraudulent financial records. He's attempted to hide assets before filing for divorce. These aren't just grounds for dismissal. They're potentially criminal offenses. Her eyes widened as the implications sank in. But I didn't know. Intent matters in legal proceedings, I acknowledged. But so does participation. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you want to go down with Carlos's ship, or whether you want to save yourself. Grace stared. At me, conflict evident in her expression. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, I replied carefully, that you consider your options. Carlos created this situation, but he won't hesitate to let you take the fall if it serves his interests. She glanced toward the terrace where Carlos stood, his back to us, phone pressed to his ear. He was likely calling Mike, his attorney, desperate for a way out of the trap closing around him. I never meant to hurt anyone, Grace said quietly. I know that sounds like a cliché, but it's true. Carlos told me your marriage was already over in all but name. I nodded, unsurprised. Carlos excels at crafting convenient narratives. Grace hesitated, then unclasped the silver bracelet from her wrist. She placed it on the table between us, the antique filigree catching the candlelight. I had no idea this was your grandmother's, she said. He told me it was a Rivera family piece that his mother wanted me to have. I picked up the bracelet, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. 3 generations of Vega women had worn it, including my mother on her wedding day. The fact that Carlos had taken it, knowing its significance, and given it to Grace was perhaps the most personal betrayal of all. Thank you, I said simply, slipping it into my purse. There was a moment of awkward silence between us. 2 women whose lives had become entangled in ways neither had fully anticipated. What will happen to him? Grace asked finally. That depends largely on his next moves, I answered truthfully. If he fights this, if he tries to deny the financial improprieties, or shift blame to others, the consequences will be severe. If he accepts responsibility and cooperates, I shrugged slightly. The landing might be softer. Grace nodded slowly, processing this information. And what about me? It was a fair question. In my months of planning, I had focused primarily on Carlos's downfall, seeing Grace as merely an extension of his betrayal. But sitting across from her now, I recognized the complexity of her situation. That depends on you, I said. On what? You knew, what you participated in, and what you're willing to disclose. Before she could respond, Carlos returned to the table, his expression tightly controlled, but a new tension evident in his shoulders. Whatever conversation he'd just had on the terrace had not provided the escape route he'd hoped for. He paused, noticing the absence of the bracelet from Grace's wrist and the shift in the dynamic between us. Something had changed during his absence, and he knew it. Your attorney unavailable? I asked mildly. Carlos sat down, ignoring my question. We need to discuss this privately, Carmen. Just the two of us. I think we're beyond that point, I replied. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of Grace. After all, she's part of this situation now. This is between us, he insisted. Our marriage, our company, our assets. Including the house at Westlake Shores? I asked. The house you promised to Grace? The house you took her to visit repeatedly over the past 3 months, making plans. For your future together? Carlos's jaw tightened. How did you... No, I finished for him. The security system. I receive alerts whenever anyone enters the property. Did you really think I wouldn't notice your repeated visits? Or that I wouldn't review the security footage? Grace looked between us, clearly stunned by this new revelation. You've been spying on me? Carlos demanded. I've been protecting my property, I corrected. The house that I purchased, that I designed, that I own. I removed my phone from my purse and pulled up the security app. With a few taps, I accessed the saved footage and turned the screen toward them. The video showed Carlos and Grace walking through the partially constructed home, his arm around her waist, stopping to kiss in what would have been the master bedroom. March 12th, I said, as the timestamp displayed in the corner of the video. The day you told me you were in Chicago for a board meeting. Grace's face flushed with embarrassment. Carlos's expression hardened into anger. You had no right. I had every right, I cut him off. It's my property, and as it turns out, documenting your lies has proven quite useful. The waiter approached with our main course, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the obvious tension at our table. Roasted lamb for Madame, he said, placing the plate before me, and the Chilean sea bass for Sir and Miss. Thank you, Joseph, I said. Everything looks wonderful. As Joseph retreated, Carlos leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. What will it take to end this? Name your price. It was a revealing statement. Even now, facing the collapse of his career and reputation, Carlos still believed everything could be reduced to a transaction, that I could be bought off like a business competitor. You still don't understand, I said, almost pitying him. This isn't a negotiation. This is a consequence. My phone buzzed with another message from Courtney. Documents delivered to all board members. Sofia Rivera has requested a private meeting with you tomorrow morning before the board convenes. Perfect. Carlos's mother had always been practical, more concerned with protecting the company's reputation than her son's ego. If she was requesting a meeting, it meant she understood the severity of the situation. Your mother would like to see me tomorrow, I informed Carlos. Before the board meeting. The color drained from his face. Leave my mother out of this. I'm afraid that's not possible, I replied. As a major shareholder, she needs to be fully informed about what's happening with the company. Carlos looked desperate now, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Carmen, please, we can work this out. But it was too late for that. Far too late. Carlos stared at his untouched plate. his mind visibly racing through diminishing options. Grace picked at her sea bass, avoiding eye contact with either of us. The elegant evening I had planned months ago, before discovering Carlos's betrayal, continued its choreographed progression around us. "The board won't simply remove me," Carlos said finally, grasping at what he perceived as his strongest position. "I've increased company value by 30% in the last 2 years. Alone, the shareholders would revolt." I took a sip of my wine, appreciating its complex notes even as I prepared to dismantle another of Carlos's illusions. "The Rivera-Vega merger integration strategies that boosted our market position," I reminded him. "Who led those initiatives?" Carlos shifted uncomfortably. "You had input, certainly. I designed the entire integration framework," I corrected. "The same framework that industry journals credited for that 30% growth." I set down my glass. "And the Westlake development, that's projected to become our most profitable residential venture to date? My project from conception." "You were a consultant at best," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is that what you told the board?" I asked. "Because the project briefs and meeting minutes tell a different story, as does the press. Coverage where you specifically credited me with spearheading those initiatives." Grace looked between us, clearly reassessing everything Carlos had told her about my role in the company. "The board has received a comprehensive report," I continued, detailing my contributions to Rivera Enterprises over the past 15 years, alongside documentation of the financial irregularities discovered during Benny's review. "This is character assassination," Carlos protested, but his words rang hollow even to his own ears. "This is accountability," I countered. "Something you've managed to avoid for too long." I thought back to the moment 3 months ago when I had first confirmed my suspicions about Carlos's affair. Finding Grace's lipstick, a shade I would never wear, on one of his dress shirts had been the catalyst. But it was discovering the unauthorized transfers from our joint account that had truly spurred me to action. My mother had raised me to be vigilant, to never be financially dependent on anyone. "Men come and go," she'd told me when I announced my engagement to Carlos. "But financial security is forever." Her insistence on the prenuptial agreement had been just one manifestation of that philosophy. When I'd discovered Carlos's betrayal, my first call hadn't been to a divorce attorney, but to Benny Rodriguez, the company's CFO and my mother's most trusted lieutenant. "I need to know exactly what Carlos has been doing with company finances," I'd told him, "especially any transactions that might seem unusual." Benny's investigation had revealed more than just Carlos's affair. It had uncovered a pattern of financial manipulation, not embezzlement exactly, but a systematic blurring of lines between personal and corporate resources. Carlos had been using company assets as his personal playground, secure in his belief that his position was unassailable. My second call had been to Courtney Mendez, not just my attorney, but my closest friend since law school. "I need to review every document Carlos has signed in the past decade," I'd told her, "especially anything related to our prenup or property ownership." Together, Courtney and I had meticulously documented every asset, every ownership claim, every potential vulnerability in Carlos's position. We'd strategized for every possible scenario, anticipating his moves before he made them. When I'd learned about the Westlake Shores house, that Carlos had been taking Grace there, planning their future in a home I had designed, the final piece of my plan had fallen into place. "Do you remember what you said to me last month?" I asked Carlos now, when I mentioned redecorating our bedroom. He frowned, caught off guard by the apparent change of subject. "I don't recall." "You said there was no point investing in changes to a house we wouldn't be living in much longer," I reminded him. At the time, I pretended not to understand the implication, but I knew exactly what you meant. You were already planning your exit. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her seat, perhaps realizing for the first time just how calculated Carlos's actions had been. "That comment," I continued, was what prompted me to accelerate my timeline, to ensure that everything was in place before you made your move. Carlos's expression darkened as he realized how thoroughly I had anticipated his actions. You've been planning this for months. Yes, I acknowledged. Just as you've been planning to leave me for months. The difference is my plan was better executed. I reached into my purse and removed a small USB drive, placing it on the table between us. This contains everything, Carlos. Every financial record, every property document, every security footage from the Westlake house, every text message between you and Grace that passed through company servers. That's invasion of privacy, he protested weakly. Company communications. On company devices are subject to monitoring, I reminded him. As stated in the employee handbook that you approved last year. Grace paled. All of our messages? Not personal communications on private devices, I clarified, but anything sent through company channels, yes. The implications settled over the table like a heavy fog. Carlos had been careless, leaving digital breadcrumbs that now formed a damning trail of evidence. The board meeting tomorrow isn't just about financial improprieties, I said, watching. Realization dawn on Carlos's face. It's about a comprehensive review of leadership, about whether someone who has demonstrated such poor judgment in both personal and professional matters should continue to lead Rivera Enterprises. Carlos's phone buzzed again. He checked it, his expression hardening. My mother wants to see me tonight, he said tightly. Immediately after dinner. I nodded, unsurprised. Sofia Rivera was not a woman who waited for problems to come to her. She was always fond of me, I remarked. I think she'll be particularly disappointed to learn how you've handled all of this. The scent of expensive perfume wafted over our table as an elegant, silver-haired woman approached from across the restaurant. All three of us looked up in surprise. Speaking of your mother, I said softly, it appears she's decided not to wait until after dinner. Sofia Rivera approached our table with the graceful authority of a woman who had navigated high society for decades. At 72, she remained strikingly elegant, her silver hair swept into a perfect chignon, her tailored navy suit emphasizing her still slender figure. Her dark eyes, so like Carlos's, missed nothing as she took in the scene. Before her, Mother, Carlos said, rising hastily. I didn't expect... Clearly, Sofia interrupted, her gaze shifting between the three of us. When Elena Vega calls me at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, I pay attention. She turned to me with genuine warmth. Carmen, querida, I see you're having quite an eventful anniversary dinner? Sofia, I greeted her, standing to accept her embrace. It's lovely to see you, though I wish the circumstances were different. As do I, she agreed, her accent becoming more pronounced as it always did when she was upset. Carlos, you will introduce me to your companion. Grace stood awkwardly, smoothing her emerald dress. Grace Kendall, she said, extending her hand. It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Rivera. Sofia regarded Grace's hand for a beat too long before taking it briefly. Ms. Kendall, I understand you work for my son. Yes, I'm his executive assistant, Grace confirmed, the words sounding hollow in the context of our dinner. Among other things, apparently, Sofia observed dryly. She turned to Joseph, who had materialized at her elbow. I will join this table. Bring me whatever wine Carmen is drinking. Of course, madame, Joseph replied, quickly arranging a fourth-place setting. Carlos remained standing, visibly unsettled by his mother's unexpected appearance. Mother, this isn't the best time for— Sit down, Carlos, Sofia commanded in the tone that had cowed boardroom executives for decades. If you are old enough to destroy your marriage and jeopardize the company your father built, you are old enough to face the consequences in public. Carlos sank back into his chair, the confident CEO momentarily reduced to a chastened son. It was a remarkable transformation, and one that Grace was clearly struggling to reconcile with the dominant, self-assured man she'd been involved with. "Now," Sophia said, settling elegantly into her chair, "Elena tells me there are financial irregularities that threaten our company. She tells me my son has been using corporate funds for personal expenses related to," she glanced pointedly at Grace, "extracurricular activities. There have been some accounting issues," Carlos began defensively, "but nothing that—" "Benny Rodriguez has identified over $2 million in questionable transactions over the past 6 months," I interjected calmly, "all linked to Carlos's personal expenses or properties purchased through shell companies." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "Is this true?" "It's a mischaracterization," Carlos insisted. "Those were legitimate business expenses that may have been incorrectly categorized." "Including the diamond bracelet from Tiffany's?" I asked. "Or the weekend in Aspen? Or perhaps the down payment on the Westlake Shores property?" Sophia turned to Grace, who seemed to be trying to make herself as small as possible. "And you, Ms. Kendall, what was your role in all this?" I just processed the paperwork as Carlos directed," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know they were improper." "She's telling the truth," I confirmed, surprising both Grace and Carlos. Grace was following instructions. She may have suspected something was wrong, but the evidence suggests Carlos deliberately kept her in the dark about the full extent of his financial manipulations. Grace shot me a grateful look, clearly not having expected any defense from me. "How generous of you, Carmen," Sophia remarked, studying me with newfound respect. "Most women in your position would not be so discerning." "This isn't about punishing everyone associated with Carlos," I explained. "It's about accountability, where it's due." Joseph returned with Sophia's wine and took the opportunity to refill our glasses. The ritual of fine dining continued around us, an incongruous backdrop to the family drama unfolding at our table. "The board meeting tomorrow," Sophia said after taking a sip of her wine. "What exactly do you intend to present?" "Evidence of financial improprieties," I replied, "documentation of Carlos's misuse of company resources, and a proposal for restructuring leadership to protect shareholders' interests." "You want my son removed as CEO," Sophia stated bluntly. "I want what's best for the company," I countered. "Whether that includes Carlos in a leadership role depends entirely on his actions from this point forward." Carlos leaned forward, sensing a potential opening. "Mother, Carmen is overreacting to a personal situation. The company is thriving under my leadership." "The company is thriving because of initiatives Carmen developed," Sophia corrected him, surprising us all. "Do you think I don't know what happens in my own company? Your father always said Carmen was the strategic mind behind your success. It appears he was right." Carlos stared at his mother, stunned by this revelation. "You knew?" "Of course I knew," Sophia replied dismissively. "I've been attending charity luncheons with board members' wives for 30 years. People talk, Carlos, especially about a CEO who takes credit for his wife's innovations." The dynamic at the table shifted once again as Carlos realized that even his mother, his most reliable ally, had been aware of his professional shortcomings all along. "What do you suggest we do?" Sophia asked me directly, effectively sidelining her son from the conversation. "Carlos needs to take immediate leave from his position," I said. "Benny Rodriguez can serve as interim CEO while the board conducts a thorough review of all financial matters. Carlos should return all company property, including access to the Westlake Shores house." "And personally?" Sophia pressed. "That's between Carlos and me," I said, "and our attorneys." Sophia nodded thoughtfully, then turned to her son. "Carlos, you will call an emergency executive committee meeting tonight. You will announce your temporary leave of absence for personal reasons. You will surrender all company access cards, devices, and properties to Benny Rodriguez before midnight." "Mother, you can't possibly—" "I can, and I will," Sophia cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "Your father would be ashamed of how you've conducted yourself. both as a husband and as a CEO. The words landed like physical blows. Carlos flinched, the mention of his father's potential disappointment striking a vulnerability I hadn't anticipated. "This is ridiculous," Carlos said, attempting to reclaim some authority. "The company needs stability, not a hasty leadership change based on personal grievances." "This stopped being a personal grievance," Sophia replied evenly, "the moment you used company resources to finance your affair." She turned to Grace. "Ms. Kendall, I believe your position at Rivera Enterprises has become untenable." Grace paled. "Are you firing me?" "Consider it a paid administrative leave," Sophia clarified, "pending a full investigation into your knowledge of and participation in these financial irregularities." "That's not fair," Carlos protested. "Grace was following my instructions. If anyone should be held accountable, it's me." It was the first honorable thing he'd said all evening, and I found myself surprised by this flash of integrity amid his otherwise self-serving behavior. "How gallant of you to defend her now," Sophia observed dryly. "Where was this concern for others when you were planning to humiliate your wife at your anniversary dinner?" Carlos had no response to that. The carefully orchestrated evening he had planned, where he would magnanimously inform me of his decision to leave our marriage, had spiraled completely beyond his control. Joseph approached the table once more. "The main course," he announced, as if we were simply enjoying a normal celebratory dinner. "Would Madame like me to bring another entree for the new guest?" "Just coffee for me, thank you," Sophia replied. "I've already dined." As Joseph retreated, Carlos's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, then excused himself to take the call. From his expression, I suspected it was Mike, his attorney, finally returning his calls. With Carlos momentarily absent, Sophia turned her penetrating gaze to Grace. "Young woman, let me offer you some advice. Whatever Carlos has promised you, advancement in the company, financial security, a future together, understand that those promises are built on quicksand." Grace shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Rivera, I'm not finished," Sophia continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I've known my son for 45 years. He is charming, ambitious, and utterly self-serving when it suits him. The same pattern has repeated throughout his life. He uses people until they no longer serve his purposes, then discards them." I watched as Grace absorbed this assessment, her eyes darting to where Carlos stood on the terrace, gesticulating emphatically into his phone. "You have a choice to make," Sophia continued. "You can remain loyal to Carlos and likely go down with him, or you can cooperate with the investigation and possibly salvage your career." "I never intentionally did anything wrong," Grace insisted, though her voice wavered. "Intent matters less than actions in situations like this," Sophia said with the wisdom of someone who had navigated corporate politics for decades. "What matters now is what you do next." I sipped my wine, watching this exchange with interest. Sophia was offering Grace the same choice I had suggested earlier, but coming from Carlos's mother, it carried different weight. It was no longer just the spurned wife trying to turn Carlos's mistress against him. It was his own mother acknowledging his character flaws and the danger of remaining in his orbit. My phone buzzed with another text from Courtney. "All financial records secured. Benny standing by for executive committee meeting. Kendall Williams called, wants to meet regarding her NDA for the Westlake project." "Perfect timing," I replied quickly. "Schedule Kendall for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Have her bring all design documents. Kendall." Williams, the interior designer who had worked on the Westlake house, had been caught in an uncomfortable position when Carlos had brought Grace to consult on design elements for what was supposedly their future home. The non-disclosure agreement Kendall had signed with my holding company had put her in the awkward position of designing a house for a couple when she knew the true owner was someone else entirely. Carlos returned to the table, his expression grim. "Mike suggests we postpone any decisions until we've had proper legal consultation," he announced. clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Mike works for the company, not for you personally, I reminded him. And as he's surely aware, the corporate bylaws give the board authority to place any executive on administrative leave when there are credible allegations of financial impropriety. This isn't about bylaws, Carlos argued. This is about you being vindictive because of our personal situation. Oh, Carlos, Sophia interjected with evident disappointment. Still, you refuse to accept responsibility. This is precisely why the board will support Carmen's position. The board doesn't even know the full situation yet, Carlos countered. They will by morning, I assured him. The documentation has already been delivered to each member, including the footage from the Westlake property showing your visits with Grace while you were supposedly on business trips. Grace set down her fork, abandoning any pretense of eating. You recorded us at the house? She asked, her voice barely audible. Security cameras, I clarified. Standard for all Rivera Vega properties during construction. The system sends automatic alerts to the property owner, me, whenever anyone enters without authorization. The implications sank in. Not only did I have evidence of their affair, but I had time-stamped video proving Carlos had been lying about his whereabouts on multiple occasions. That's invasion of privacy, Carlos protested. Not on property I own, I replied simply. And certainly not when the security system is clearly disclosed in all construction documents, which you signed as CEO. Carlos looked as if he might explode with frustration. Everything he had carefully arranged was disintegrating before his eyes. The smooth exit from his marriage, the seamless transition to his new life with Grace, the continued control of the company, all of it was slipping through his fingers like sand. What exactly do you want? He demanded, desperation edging into his voice. It was the second time he'd asked me that question tonight, but this time the tone was different. Before, he'd been calculating, trying to determine the minimum concession, needed to make me go away. Now, he was genuinely at a loss, unable to see a path forward that didn't lead to professional and personal ruin. I want, I said deliberately, exactly what I'm getting. Carlos's phone buzzed again. He checked it, his jaw tightening as he read the message. The executive committee has convened an emergency meeting, he said, his voice hollow. Tonight, 9:30. You should go, Sophia advised. Better to face them directly than appear to be hiding. This is happening too fast, Carlos protested. I need time to prepare, to review the allegations. The time for preparation was before you decided to misuse company resources, I pointed out. The evidence is clear, Carlos. Benny has documented every transaction. Grace, who had been silent for several minutes, suddenly asked, What about the house? You said you own it, but Carlos showed me the purchase agreement with his signature. It was a fair question, and one that demonstrated she wasn't entirely oblivious to the legal implications of their situation. Carlos has authorization to sign certain documents on behalf of Rivera Vega Properties, I explained. It's an arrangement we established years ago to streamline transactions when I was unavailable. However, that authorization doesn't extend to personal use or transfer of property without board approval. In other words, Sophia translated for Grace's benefit, he had the authority to sign, but not to claim ownership or promise the property to you. Grace turned to Carlos, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. So we don't own the house at Westlake Shores? We never did? The situation is complicated, Carlos hedged, unwilling to admit the extent of his deception even now. It's actually quite simple, I countered, removing another document from my envelope. This is the deed to 47 Lakeside Terrace, Westlake Shores. It clearly shows Rivera Vega Properties as the owner, with me as the managing partner. I slid the document across the table to Grace, who studied it with growing dismay. But the furniture? We ordered. The design plans? All approved by me, I confirmed. Kendall Williams has been sending all design proposals to me for final approval, as required by her contract with Rivera Vega Properties. The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. Kendall knew, all this time. She was bound by a non-disclosure agreement, I explained. She couldn't tell you who really owned the property without breaching her contract. Carlos checked his watch anxiously. I need to go. The executive committee— You still don't get it, do you? Sophia interrupted, her disappointment evident. This isn't just about the executive committee or the board. This is about trust, Carlos. Trust you've broken with your wife, with your colleagues, and apparently with this young woman as well. Grace's eyes filled with tears, though whether from anger or humiliation, I couldn't tell. You lied to me, she said to Carlos, her voice barely above a whisper. About everything. Not everything, he insisted, reaching for her hand across the table. What's between us is real. She pulled away from his touch. Is it? Or was I just convenient? Someone who admired you, who wouldn't? Question your decisions. Who could be impressed by your supposed generosity with a house you didn't even own? It was remarkable to witness Grace's transformation from the confident other woman to someone confronting the possibility that she too had been manipulated and deceived. Ms. Kendall, Sophia said gently, perhaps you should consider your next steps carefully. Carlos must attend this executive committee meeting, but you are under no obligation to wait for him. The implication was clear. Grace had a chance to distance herself from Carlos before his professional downfall became complete. My phone buzzed with another message from Courtney. Benny reports executive committee already discussing interim leadership. Board chair requesting your presence at tomorrow's meeting. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The carefully laid groundwork of the past 3 months was coming to fruition with a precision that even I found satisfying. Carlos stood, straightening his tie in a futile attempt to reclaim some dignity. I'll deal with this misunderstanding and be back shortly, he told Grace, though his lack of conviction was evident to everyone at the table. I won't be here, Grace replied, finally finding her voice. I'm going home. My actual home. Not some house you pretended to buy for us. Carlos looked stricken, as if only now realizing that he was losing both his wife and his mistress in the same evening. Grace, please. You should go, she said firmly. Your executive committee is waiting. As Carlos hesitated, Sophia rose from her seat. I'll accompany you, she informed him. As a major shareholder, I have a vested interest in this discussion. Carlos knew better than to argue with his mother. With a last desperate look at Grace, he turned and walked toward the restaurant exit, Sophia following with regal composure. Joseph, I called to the waiter who had been discreetly managing our unusual dining experience. Could you please call a car for Miss Kendall? Of course, madame, he replied. It will be here in 5 minutes. As Joseph stepped away, Grace and I were left alone at the table, an unexpected moment of privacy in what had been an increasingly public confrontation. I never meant to hurt you, Grace said after a long silence. I believed him when he said your marriage was already over, that you were just going through the motions. I know, I said, surprising myself with the genuine understanding in my heart. Carlos has always been skilled at creating narratives that suit his purposes. The bracelet, she said suddenly, her hand moving instinctively to her now bare wrist. If I'd known it was your grandmother's, there's a line I wouldn't have crossed. It was an unexpected moment of humanity from someone I'd pictured as a one-dimensional homewrecker. The evening's revelations had clearly forced her to reconsider not just Carlos, but her own role in our triangle. What happens now? She asked, a vulnerability in her voice that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. That depends partly on you, I replied truthfully, on what you knew about the financial improprieties and what you're willing to disclose. Grace stared into her wineglass, conflict evident in her expression. I processed transactions as Carlos directed, she admitted finally. Backdated some approval forms, created expense reports for meetings that never happened. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. I knew it wasn't right, but I convinced myself it was just corporate flexibility, not actual fraud. "Did you know about Horizon Ventures?" I asked, referring to the shell company Carlos had created. "In her name!" She shook her head emphatically. "Not until you mentioned it tonight. I signed some incorporation papers Carlos said were related to a new marketing initiative. He said it was routine." Her voice cracked slightly. I trusted him. Joseph approached to inform us that Grace's car had arrived. She gathered her purse, the confident mistress who had strutted into the restaurant, now replaced by a woman whose world had been upended in the space of a dinner. "What will you do?" I asked as she stood to leave. She hesitated. "I don't know. Everything I thought I had. The relationship, the promotion he promised, the house. None of it was real." "Some advice," I offered, surprising myself. "Document everything. Every instruction Carlos gave you, every document you signed at his direction. It won't absolve you completely, but it will help establish that you were following orders rather than initiating fraud." Grace nodded, processing this unexpected guidance from the woman whose marriage she had helped destroy. "Why are you helping? Me?" It was a fair question. By any conventional standard, I should have wanted to see her suffer along with Carlos. "Because this isn't about punishing everyone in Carlos's orbit," I replied after a moment's reflection. "It's about accountability, where it's due." After Grace departed, I sat alone at the table that had been set for an anniversary celebration and had instead hosted the dismantling of my marriage. The restaurant was quieter now, most of the other diners having finished their meals. The candles had burned lower, casting elongated shadows across the white tablecloth. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what had transpired. 15 years of marriage, ending not with private tears, but with public revelations of betrayal and deceit. The house I had designed with such care, intended as a peaceful retreat for our future, now tainted by memories of Carlos showing it to his mistress. My phone lit up with another message from Courtney. "Executive committee meeting proceeding. Carlos defensive, then angry. Sophia intervened. Vote of no confidence appears imminent." The professional consequences for Carlos were unfolding exactly as I had anticipated. By morning, he would likely be suspended from his position pending a full board review. His reputation within the company, built over decades, would be irreparably damaged. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a curious emptiness, as if the precision of my revenge had somehow drained it of satisfaction. Joseph approached with the dessert I had ordered weeks ago when planning this anniversary dinner. Chocolate soufflé with raspberries. Carlos's favorite. The careful timing of the kitchen staff meant it had arrived perfectly risen, despite the drama that had consumed our table. "Would Madame like the dessert?" Joseph asked delicately, recognizing that circumstances had changed dramatically since I had placed the order. "Yes," I decided. "And an espresso, please." There was something oddly empowering about enjoying this final course alone, savoring flavors that had once been chosen to please my husband, but now existed solely for my pleasure. As I savored the rich chocolate soufflé, my phone lit up with an incoming call from Courtney. I stepped away from the table to answer it. "It's done," she said without preamble. "The executive committee has voted to place Carlos on administrative leave pending a full board review. Benny Rodriguez has been named interim CEO." "How did Carlos take it?" I asked, curious despite myself. "Not well," Courtney replied. "He accused you of orchestrating a corporate coup, tried to claim the financial issues were simple administrative errors." Then Sophia spoke up. "What did she say?" "That she had reviewed the evidence herself and found it compelling. That the board's primary responsibility was to the company, not to protecting her son from the consequences of his actions." Courtney's voice held a note of admiration. It was quite something to witness. Carlos looked stunned. I thanked Courtney for the update and returned to my table, processing this development. The swift and decisive action of the executive committee confirmed what I had long suspected. Carlos's position had been more vulnerable than he realized. His success had depended not just on his own abilities, but on the goodwill and trust of those around him, including me. As I finished my espresso, Joseph approached with a small silver tray. "A message for you, madame," he said, presenting an envelope with my name written in Sophia's elegant script. Inside was a brief note. "Carmen, once you have finished your dessert, please join me at the house. There are matters we should discuss. Privately. Sophia." The house could only mean the Rivera family estate, where Carlos and I had lived for the first 5 years of our marriage before purchasing our own home. It was where Sophia still resided, maintaining the property with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her approach to business. I settled the bill, charging it to the corporate account Carlos had planned to use for his anniversary dinner announcement, and made my way to my car. The night air was cool against my skin, a refreshing contrast to the emotionally charged atmosphere of the restaurant. As I drove through the familiar gates of the Rivera estate, 20 minutes later, I was struck by the property's timeless elegance. The Spanish colonial architecture, the perfectly maintained gardens, the soft landscape lighting illuminating ancient oak trees, all of it spoke to generations of care and continuity. Sophia was waiting for me in the garden courtyard, seated on a stone bench beside a small fountain. She had changed from her navy suit into a simple black dress, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. In this more relaxed setting, the resemblance between her and Carlos was more pronounced. The same strong jawline, the same thoughtful eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said as I joined her on the bench. "I thought it best we speak away from corporate settings and listening ears." "How did the executive committee meeting end?" I asked. "As expected," she replied. "Carlos has been relieved of his duties pending review. He's angry, hurt, and looking for someone to blame." She paused, studying me in the gentle garden lighting. "Right now, that someone is you." I nodded, unsurprised. Carlos had never been good at accepting responsibility for his actions. It was easier to cast me as the vindictive wife orchestrating his downfall than to acknowledge his own role in creating this situation. "But that's not why I asked you here," Sophia continued, her voice softening. "I wanted to ask about your plans for Rivera Enterprises." The question caught me off guard. "My plans?" "Yes," Sophia said simply. "With Carlos removed from leadership, the company is at a crossroads. The board will be looking for stability and vision. You have both." The implication of Sophia's words hung in the night air between us. She wasn't just asking about my plans. She was suggesting I should have a direct role in the company's future leadership. "I never intended to take Carlos's position," I said carefully. "My goal was accountability, not power." "Intentions evolve," Sophia replied with the wisdom of her years. "And sometimes the most effective leadership comes from those who didn't seek it." She leaned back slightly, regarding me with thoughtful eyes. "You've been the strategic mind behind many of our most successful initiatives. The board knows this, even if Carlos tried to claim sole credit." The fountain bubbled softly beside us, its gentle rhythm creating a meditative backdrop to our conversation. In this peaceful setting, far from the corporate offices and the dramatic scene at the restaurant, I could think more clearly about what I truly wanted. The company needs stabilization right now, I acknowledged. But there would be resistance to my appointment in any official capacity. I'm still Carlos's wife, regardless of our personal situation. Soon-to-be ex-wife, Sophia corrected gently. And yes, there would be some resistance initially, but business is business, Carmen. Results speak louder than personal entanglements. She reached into a small portfolio beside her and withdrew several documents. "These are the preliminary reports on the Westlake Shores development, your development. The projections show it becoming our most profitable residential venture to date. I glanced at the financial analyses, noting the impressively positive forecasts. The Westlake project had been my vision from the beginning, a sustainability-focused luxury community that balanced environmental responsibility with high-end design. Carlos had initially dismissed the concept as too niche, only embracing it once the market research confirmed my instincts. The board meeting tomorrow isn't just about Carlos's misconduct, Sophia continued. It's about the future direction of Rivera Enterprises. You should be there, not just as a witness against Carlos, but as a voice for what comes next. I considered her words carefully. My plans had focused so intently on exposing Carlos's deception and protecting what was rightfully mine that I hadn't given much thought to what would follow. The satisfaction of revenge, while powerful, was ultimately fleeting. What remained afterward was what mattered. There's another option, I said slowly, an idea taking shape. One that might face less resistance than my direct involvement in company leadership. Sophia raised an eyebrow, inviting me to continue. Rivera Vega Properties could propose a formal partnership with Rivera Enterprises on the Westlake development and future residential projects. As managing partner of Rivera Vega, I would oversee these ventures while Benny continues as interim CEO of the parent company. A smile of approval spread across Sophia's face. A strategic alliance rather than a direct power play. The board would be more receptive to that approach, especially with the projected returns from Westlake. It would also create some professional distance between me and Carlos during the divorce proceedings, I added. Less potential for claims that I'm seeking control of his company out of spite. Sophia nodded appreciatively. You've always had a gift for seeing multiple moves ahead. It's what makes you a better strategist than my son. The compliment, coming from a woman I had long admired for her business acumen, meant more than I expected. Throughout my marriage to Carlos, I had often deferred to him publicly while guiding decisions from behind the scenes. The prospect of stepping into my own power, of claiming credit for my vision and strategies, was both daunting and exhilarating. There's something else to consider, Sophia said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Carlos won't simply disappear. Whatever settlement you reach, whatever professional arrangement is made, he will remain connected to this company through family ties and history. I'm well aware that Carlos won't simply fade away, I acknowledged. He's too proud, too connected to the Rivera name and legacy. Precisely, Sophia agreed, which means you'll need to consider how to manage that reality going forward. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Carlos called me after the executive committee meeting. He wants to meet with you tomorrow, before the board convenes. My first instinct was refusal. What could Carlos possibly say that would matter now? The evidence was overwhelming, his position compromised, our marriage effectively over. He's desperate, I surmised. Looking for a way to salvage something from this situation. Yes, Sophia confirmed, but there may be value in hearing what he has to say, not for his benefit, but for yours, for closure if nothing else. As I considered her advice, my phone buzzed with a message from Benny. Carlos demanding access to Westlake property tonight, security asking for guidance. The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, facing professional disgrace and personal humiliation, Carlos still believed he had rights to a property that had never been his. It seems your son is attempting to access the Westlake house, I informed Sophia, showing her the message. Her expression hardened. His judgment continues to fail him. She shook her head slightly. What will you do? I typed a quick response. Deny access. Advise security to inform him the property belongs to Rivera Vega and he has no authorization. He won't take that well, Sophia observed. No, I agreed. But it's time Carlos learned that actions have consequences. Almost immediately, my phone rang, Carlos calling directly. I showed Sophia the screen. You should answer, she advised. Better to deal with this now than let it fester until tomorrow. I accepted the call, placing it on speaker out of respect for Sophia's presence. Carmen, Carlos began, his voice tight, with controlled anger. I'm at Westlake. The security team is refusing me entry to our property. Not our property, Carlos, I corrected calmly. Rivera Vega's property. My property. This is ridiculous, he snapped. I signed the purchase agreement. I approved the construction contracts. On behalf of Rivera Vega Properties, I reminded him. As you were authorized to do as a signatory, not as an owner. The distinction is quite clear in the corporate documents. Documents you signed but apparently never bothered to read carefully. There was a moment of tense silence before he spoke again. Is my mother with you? Yes, I confirmed. We're at the estate. Another. I'm coming there, he declared. We need to talk, all of us, before this goes any further. Before I could respond, he had ended the call. I looked at Sophia, who seemed unsurprised by her son's reaction. He always did prefer confrontation to reflection, she observed dryly. He'll be here within 20 minutes. We moved from the garden into the main house, settling in the elegant living room where family discussions had taken place for generations. Sophia asked her housekeeper to prepare coffee, the formality of proper hospitality never forgotten even in tense situations. What will you say to him? Sophia asked as we waited. I considered the question carefully. The vindictive part of me wanted to refuse any compromise, to watch Carlos face the full consequences of his actions without mitigation. But 15 years of marriage, despite its painful end, deserved more than scorched earth tactics. I'll listen, I decided. But I won't back down on the essentials. The Westlake property, my position with the company, the financial accounting. Sophia nodded approvingly. Strength with dignity. It's what I've always admired about you, Carmen. The sound of tires on. The gravel driveway announced Carlos's arrival. Moments later, the front door opened and closed with more force than necessary. Carlos appeared in the living room doorway, his tie loosened, his expression a mixture of anger and apprehension. He stopped short when he saw us sitting together, perhaps realizing for the first time that his mother had truly aligned herself with me in this conflict. What is this? Carlos demanded, his gaze darting between us. Some kind of alliance against me? Sit down, Carlos, Sophia directed firmly. This is still my home, and you will conduct yourself accordingly. The subtle reminder of his guest status in what had once been his childhood home wasn't lost on Carlos. He complied, though his rigid posture conveyed his resistance. The board has received all the documentation, I said without preamble. Financial records, property deeds, evidence of the shell company you created in Grace's name. There's no point in denying any of it. I'm not here to deny, Carlos replied, his tone shifting to something more measured. I'm here to propose a resolution that protects the company's interests and our family's reputation. Interesting that those concerns emerge only after you've been caught, Sophia observed dryly. Carlos ignored his mother's comment, focusing on me instead. The Westlake property, he began. It's become a flashpoint in this situation, but it doesn't have to be. I'll acknowledge Rivera Vega's ownership and formally withdraw any personal claims to it. You never had any legitimate claims to withdraw, I pointed out. But continue. He leaned forward slightly. In exchange, I ask that you support a narrative for the board that frames the financial irregularities as administrative oversights rather than intentional misconduct. A temporary leave of absence for me instead of outright dismissal? I studied him, noting the desperation beneath his attempted composure. And what about our marriage? Were you planning to frame that as an administrative oversight as well? Color rose in his face. Our personal situation is separate from the company issues. No, Carlos, I contradicted. You made them inseparable when you used company resources to finance your affair. When you took Grace to a property owned by my family's company and pretended it was yours. When you stole my grandmother's bracelet to give to your mistress. I made mistakes, he admitted, the words seeming to physically pain him. Personal mistakes that affected my judgment. But my leadership of Rivera Enterprises has been successful by any objective measure. Your leadership, I echoed, letting the words hang in the air. Tell me, Carlos, how many of the initiatives credited to your leadership were actually my ideas? How many strategies that boosted company value were developed at our dining room table, with you taking notes as I outlined approaches you hadn't considered? His silence was answer enough. Sophia set her coffee cup down with a decisive click. The issue before us isn't just about ownership of a house or improper financial transactions, she said. It's about trust, integrity, and respect. You've demonstrated a lack of all three. Mother, Carlos began, but Sophia raised her hand. To silence him. I raised you to be better than this, she continued, disappointment evident in her voice. Your father and I built Rivera Enterprises on relationships and reputation. You've damaged both. Carlos's facade of controlled negotiation began to crack. So that's it? 15 years leading the company, doubling its value, expanding into new markets. All of that counts for nothing because of a few personal indiscretions? They weren't indiscretions, I corrected. They were calculated decisions to deceive, to take what wasn't yours, to discard commitments when they became inconvenient. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11, its resonant tones emphasizing the lateness of the hour and the finality of the moment. Tomorrow morning, the board would convene to formalize decisions that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of Rivera Enterprises and our lives. I won't fight the divorce, Carlos said abruptly, shifting tactics. Full settlement on your terms. No contests. Clean break. The offer hung in the air between us, his final attempt at leveraging our personal relationship to salvage his professional position. I appreciate that, I replied evenly. But it doesn't change my responsibility to the company and the board. The financial improprieties will be presented accurately, without embellishment, but also without minimization. A year later, the morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the great room at Westlake Shores, illuminating the reclaimed timber feature wall that had been Kendall Williams' most inspired design element. I sat at the custom island in the kitchen, reviewing the quarterly reports for Rivera Vega's residential division. The past year had brought changes I could never have anticipated on that fateful anniversary night. The board had indeed removed Carlos from his position as CEO, replacing him with Benny Rodriguez on a permanent basis. My proposal for a strategic partnership between Rivera Vega Properties and Rivera Enterprises had been enthusiastically approved, creating a structure that allowed me to lead the residential development division while maintaining appropriate separation from corporate governance. Carlos and I had finalized our divorce 6 months ago. The proceedings remarkably straightforward, given his desire to avoid further public scrutiny of his actions. He had relocated to Madrid, accepting a position with a European investment firm where his name still carried weight. According to Sophia, who maintained contact with her son despite her disappointment in his choices, he had begun seeing a therapist to address the patterns that had led to his downfall. Grace had cooperated fully with the financial investigation, providing documentation that supported her claim that she had been following Carlos's directions without full understanding of their impropriety. She had left Rivera Enterprises, of course, but with references that acknowledged her marketing skills and allowed her to secure a position with a smaller firm across town. The house at Westlake Shores, the house that had become a symbol of Carlos's deception, had been completed according to my original vision. But instead of moving in myself, I had made a decision that surprised many. I donated the property to the Rivera Foundation to serve as a retreat center for young women pursuing careers in business and architecture. Today was the official opening ceremony, with 20 scholarship recipients arriving to begin a summer mentorship program under the guidance of successful women executives. including me. My phone chimed with a message from Courtney. Car service for Sophia has arrived at her house. ETA 30 minutes. Perfect timing. I wanted Sophia to be part of this day, to see how something that had begun in betrayal and pain had been transformed into an opportunity for growth and mentorship. As I closed the quarterly reports and moved to prepare for our guests, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at me was not the same one who had sat across from Carlos and Grace at that anniversary dinner a year ago. There was a confidence in her posture, a clarity in her eyes that spoke of lessons learned and strength discovered. The eye. Doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of Kendall Williams, who had generously volunteered her design expertise for the retreat center. "It looks amazing," she enthused as I welcomed her inside. "Even better than I imagined when we were working on the plans." "It feels right," I agreed. "Not just aesthetically, but purposefully. This house was meant for something more than just a personal residence." As we walked through the space, making final preparations for the opening ceremony, Kendall asked the question that many had delicately avoided. "Do you ever hear from Carlos?" "Sophia keeps me updated," I replied. "He's doing well in Madrid, building a new life. And you?" she prompted. "Are you happy with how things turned out?" The question gave me pause. Happiness seemed too simple a concept for the complex journey of the past year. What I felt was something more nuanced, a sense of alignment, of purpose rediscovered. "I'm satisfied," I said finally. Not with Carlos's betrayal or the pain it caused, but with the direction it ultimately led me. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives create unexpected opportunities for growth. Through the windows, I could see the first cars arriving. Young women with bright futures, coming to a place that had been transformed from a symbol of deception into a space for empowerment and possibility. Carlos had once called Grace the upgrade. How ironic that the real upgrade had been my own transformation, from supportive wife working in the background to acknowledged leader creating her own legacy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.